So anyways, Jason is obviously an experienced zoo worker, exotic animal handler, and but he's also an experienced Bigfoot researcher, and so he's going to talk about Australia's version of Bigfoot, which I'm sure you guys have all heard something, but maybe not the inside scoop. So please welcome Mr. Jason Kauntze Coburn.
Thank you, Ken. Well, and thank you all for coming out, helping support our expedition here. So I was lucky enough to spend some time in Australia, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about what they call the Yowie. This is actually an early rendition. Of course, an artist did this. The Yowie is basically described as being a bipedal, 6 to 12 foot tall, hairy, 8-man looking creature. The main difference between the Yowie description and Bigfoot is it is supposed to have a small head, large canines, and some of the early reports actually talk about its feet being facing backwards. That's actually something that's mentioned with a lot of mythical creatures, more the smaller type man beings. Nowadays, the modern sightings, it's really just very similar to Bigfoot. It still has the big cone head that Bigfoot has, not so much the small round head or the large canines that was described earlier. One theory, though, is that it is a type of marsupial we know this existed as well. It was a little over 6 foot, about 400 pounds, and doesn't look very much like a primate, but then there are no real primates native to Australia. Humans are the only primates there now. So it does make some biological, historical fact to it that, as you can see up here, there's 170 or 379 species of mammals in Australia. 23 were introduced. There's 140 terrestrial placental mammals. Most of those are bats and rodents, and 2 monotremes, which are the really unique mammals that actually lay eggs, and then the rest, 237 marsupials. So that lends some credence to the theory, although most don't buy into that now. They do believe it is some kind of bipedal primate. Now, most of the sightings you can see along the eastern shore, where there's most of the greenery, and it's also where most of the population in Australia live. But it would make sense that the large creature like a Yowie would be in that area. And there are still sightings going on today. This year there's actually been 3 reported sightings. Last year there were 6 reported, and all of those were in Queensland, which is up in the northeast part. Now, when I was there in 2005, it was in the middle of a 7-year drought. You can see that area up there, the Pilliga Scrub. That was not too far from where I was working, and that's where a lot of reports come in. There's one main highway that runs through it, and most of the reports came from truckers, and they were all pretty much the same. Yeah, I saw some big hairy thing run across the road. I don't know what it was. There was one report in the mid-'80s. One of the truckers had pulled over to the side of the road just to catch up on some sleep, and he was woken up by his truck being shook very violently. And this was a big transport truck. He got up, he turned on the lights, and saw a large hairy beast running off through the forest. So that was one of the best reports. Now, in the Pilliga Scrub there, you can see again in the middle. I got a good topography map and went through looking for water sources. As I said, it was middle of a drought. I went to 3 or 4 pools that had been dried up. The 4th one was when I did find some water and I actually found a print. I cast it. It looks a lot like one of Jim's biggest ones there. It was actually 21 inches long, about 9 inches at the ball of the foot and 5 inches at the heel of the foot. It was pretty impressive. There were other impressions because it was so dry that there's only one that would be castable, so that's the one I cast. I did set up camp there and I put out 2 bait stations. I used fruit, chicken, and fish and vegetables in 2 different areas. Both areas the next morning, the chicken and the fish were gone and there were tracks of a big monitor lizard. Nothing with the Yowie, but still pretty interesting. And as I said, that was in 2005. They're still having reports. Now, if you look up any pictures of the Yowie, it's very similar to Bigfoot. They're all large, hairy, bipedal, primate-looking things that are usually fuzzy pictures, fuzzy videos. But there are more people out there looking now, much like there is in this country, looking for Bigfoot. Now, the term Yowie itself is kind of a mystery as much as the creature itself as where it came from. Most people believe it's a variation of the word Yahoo, which was used by a couple of the tribes in Australia. There were over 300 different original languages. Many have been lost since then. There was one tribe in New South Wales that did consider the creature part of what they call the dream world, more a spiritual type being that did come in and out of dream world and our reality, and it was called the Yahoo. So as the early European settlers traveled there, they were hearing these stories, and they were also familiar with Robert Stevenson's novel of Gulliver's Travels. And in that, Gulliver actually goes to 3 different islands, and one island is inhabited by this ape-man type race, and it was called the Yahoo. So a lot of the early European settlers brought that with them, thinking any large hairy man-like beast, they just called it a Yahoo. I find it kind of odd that that term never came to America. Same time European explorers were coming here and settling. So it probably did come from the original Aboriginal term from New South Wales. And okay, this is actually my very first presentation ever. That's pretty much it. Open up to any questions, and I saw how all of you seem to be interested in Bigfoot. If anybody has any of their own stories, I think that would be very interesting to share. Anybody? No?
I will say that I went to Brisbane, Australia in 2010,
Mm-hmm.
and I stayed 3 weeks with my friend and her mom. And every now and again, I'd run into people that would question. They seem to be overwhelmed about Native American there. Did you you're from
Yes.
Oklahoma? I'm like, yeah. You know real Indians? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, they still think it's back cowboy Indian days, and stuff like
Well,
that.
I'm from Texas, and they all wanted to know how many guns I owned and how many cattle I owned.
Yeah. And I got to question them, and it seemed like it was split either, oh yes, they're real, or oh, phooey, If there wasn't any, I didn't see a lot of people that were like, I don't know, maybe. There could be Yowie, and I don't know if you got that same.
Yeah, because I was dealing a lot with the zoo people, and most of them just don't buy into it at all.
Yeah.
But I know just south of Brisbane, there have been a lot of sightings. And I did notice the same thing. Either, oh yeah, I'm sure they're out there, even if they hadn't seen it, or it was just, no, there's no way something like that could be there and not be known by science. Which they do have an awful lot of wilderness area, again, in the greener parts, that, I mean, you can go for days without seeing anybody out there.
I just thought it was funny that I went to Steve Irwin Zoo while I was there. And one of the zookeepers in there where they was, I was wearing a Bigfoot shirt. And when we went up there, and one of the zookeepers, I had walked in where they kept all the primates and stuff. And, one of the zookeepers said, "We're gonna have one of these days." And I was like, "What are you talking?" I didn't even realize I had this. I forgot. He goes, "Right there, mate." And I was like, "Oh yeah." And he's like, "We're gonna have one." And I said, "You really believe in him?" He goes, "Oh yeah, seen him." But some of the other zookeepers were like,
yeah. As many years as I worked in the zoo professional with exotic animals, find a lot more of them that do not believe it could exist. And I talk about it everywhere I go. Most of them just laugh at me, but then they start telling me stories of, well, this person said this and this person saw that. And that's another thing now as well, that when I first started doing research 20-something years ago, you brought up Bigfoot, everybody would laugh at you. Nowadays, I think it has a lot to do with all the TV shows about Bigfoot. It's become more acceptable to talk about it. And now, more times than people laugh at me, you'll hear them say, well, I've been hunting in these woods all my life, and there's this one time I heard something, and I don't know what it was. So, and a lot of these TV shows I just kind of laugh at, but I think they did make it okay for people to talk about.
Are you seeing more acceptance in the scientific community?
What's that?
Are you seeing more acceptance, more openness to it in the scientific community?
Very little. I would say there is more, but not as much as there is in the general public.
There's a lot of scientists out there that I think do have a guarded interest. Because I can tell you right now, I know several members of the OAS, the Oklahoma Academy of Science, that have had encounters. They're not going to come out with it. A lot of the scientists, their attitude is they aren't going to rule it out. They think there might be something there, but they're not going to be the ones to look for it, because if it gets out that you're looking for Bigfoot, you're essentially cutting your own throat as a scientist.
As an elephant trainer, didn't matter to me what people thought. It's not going to affect my career at all.
What do you think the difference or the change in the description of the animals was due to? As far as back, they had large canines, small heads. Now they're being described as like a Bigfoot with a bigger head, no canine.
I think it had a lot to do with the Aboriginals' dream world thinking of it, and even the early depictions on, the rock art and all didn't look like that one. And then as the Europeans came over, it just looked more scary. Big canines, the head smaller because it was more human-like. And again, I think the descriptions are changing because of all those TV shows. Now everybody knows what Bigfoot looks like. Yeah.
We see the same thing here with Native American art too, because a lot of your tribal depictions of Bigfoot, especially in this region, will actually depict Bigfoot as having small horns or antlers. There's Caddoan art from this area that's 1,500 years old, and they'll depict essentially a Bigfoot with antlers.
It's scarier.
Crossbreed?
No, I think it's supposed to represent the fact that it's wild. Because you got to remember, there's always art, especially with these indigenous cultures. There's always kind of a stylized element to it. It's supposed to convey a meaning in addition to just being art.
I always thought of Australia as being like really dangerous out there's all the nasty things that live out there in Australia. How many folks did you run into that would frequently go out there as opposed to?
Quite a few, because that's kind of what I did.
Okay.
But now they also think the same thing about Texas. Oh, it's scary out there. Don't know what you're
Really?
running. Yeah.
I think about all the venomous snakes, creatures, whatever, dangerous things out there. I wouldn't go wandering around Australia.
Well, no, they think about are rattlesnakes in Texas.
Okay.
You know? And it's really just what you come up with. You know, like we're used to what we're around, they're used to what they're around.
When I was going to college in Arkansas 300 years ago, I had a friend that was from Iran. And of course that was before the Shah and all that happened. We were pretty good friends. His family was friends with mine. He kept wanting to see the Indians. They're all over the place. Well, I had never seen one. I said, well, come on with me sometime, and I'll show you this Indian. Introduce me. And he said, okay, so we're going through Seminole. And there's this guy walking down the sidewalk. I said, look, that's an Indian. Man, he looks like me. We had the biggest laugh over that. And if I was to go to Australia and start walking around the woods or the swamps, I'd be scared of crocodiles. They would be around every turn, behind every log.
Well, that's kind of like when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be running into quicksand everywhere. You know, there's in all the shows. I haven't seen any quicksand to this day.
We can fix that.
Figure this guy would show me.
You guys remember, you was talking about, somebody had said something about the scientific, you know, are they starting to believe a little more or whatever? I think his name, he's a cryptolinguist. His name's Scott Nelson. I believe there's a...
The samurai chatter.
Yeah, Ron Vortex.
Yeah, where he used his Navy experience to determine whether there was a language embedded.
Mm-hmm.
I get teased a lot at work. I work out here at the Air Force Base because I've got Bigfoot stickers all over my toolbox, everything, you know. Everybody calls me Tree Knocker. And anyway, I posted a deal one day about Scott Nelson, and it just went into, and now I've got like a whole ton of guys out there that are starting to question, you know, and I'm like, there is, I mean, science can work for you too.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot more than what people want to read into. I mean, if they would stop and really read, you know, articles and, I mean, this, you know.
When I think, like Jim mentioned, it is getting a little more acceptable in the scientific community behind closed doors. They're not going to come out and make it public
Right.
what they really believe. And I've had pretty much every kind of encounter, Bigfoot encounter you could have, except for hearing that so-called samurai chatter. I'd love to hear some myself.
What kind of encounter
heard all the howls, the screams, heard huffing. I've had one sighting through a thermal imager. Some of you may know Chester Moore. And I don't think he would mind me saying this about him, but he's editor-in-chief of Texas Fish and Game. And somebody gave him a thermal imager that goes on a rifle to do an article on pig hunting at night. And he called me up and he said, this is top of the line equipment, Jason. We need to get out in the woods. So, I was there the next night. And we weren't really doing research. We were kind of like playing with a new toy. And he took me to some of his research sites, which is deep southeast Texas. And we went and we did a couple calls, and one place we heard something, not good enough to say it was a real reply. But the last place we went to, as we pulled up and got out of the truck, we heard a wood knock. And I believe, and a lot of my research friends believe, that these creatures do post like sentinels around, and that's their okay, the people are here. Because a lot of them report, as soon as they get somewhere, they'll hear one wood knock, and then that's it. So we got out, and Chester had the thermal, and he was looking at where the wood knock came from. And it was probably, it's about this size, maybe a little smaller. And he was just doing this, and he told me, he said, I think I see something. So he's holding it up, and I'm looking over his shoulder. And it was by the Sabine River. It had flooded quite a bit. We were up on a raised dirt road, and there was this thing probably 25, 30 yards out in, had to be 2 or 3 foot of water. Again, southeast Texas, you got gators, you got snakes. And I mean, it could have been a person. It couldn't have been a cow, it couldn't have been a deer, it couldn't have been a bear, but why would a person be out there? And what it was doing was the whole hiding behind a tree and peeping out. And so we watched it for about 30 seconds or so. Then all Chester did was he went like, here, you want to look? And I picked it up and looked, and it was gone. Could still see the heat signature on the tree. We didn't hear it splash off, and I'm looking up in the trees and down. Didn't hear it splash off, didn't hear it climb away. We believed the water behind it was much deeper, and it just slipped into the water. So again, the only thing it could have been was a human or a Bigfoot. And if it was a human, we certainly would have heard or seen it getting away from that area.
Going back to Australia, is there any cryptids, other cryptids over there that you may have heard of and come across? Or
Yeah, there's actually quite a few, at least as much as in Oklahoma. I didn't really research any of them or get into it too much, but it is a big country. There's a lot of wilderness. Again, over 300 different native tribes, and they all have their stories.
so, what were some of the encounters or reports that you've had over there? How did they go? I mean, like here,
The
you hear
Yowie?
people, yeah, you hear people, in the camp throwing rocks or anything. Was it similar to that, or?
All of it was very similar. Again, thinking it's a very similar creature with the same activities. Most of them, like I said, were, I saw something run, big hairy thing, I don't know what it was. But I got a lot more reports of tree limbs being thrown rather than rocks. Same howls, same screams, same roars. Not so much of them coming into camp as you get in America here with Bigfoot. But I would think similar creatures, similar activities.
You also mentioned about the thylacines.
The thylacine, yes. The thylacine is actually a creature that we know existed until it was in the 30s. The last one died in a zoo.
More about that.
But it is still reported as being seen. They call it the Tasmanian tiger, or it is just another marsupial, canine looking. And there are more and more sightings. I believe they exist. Because again, I've been out in the wilderness of Australia. There's plenty of places, plenty of food for it.
The group that researches the thylacines down there, they recently got some footage that was very interesting. They think it might actually have a thylacine on it, one of their game cams.
Was that the one that it was like a large one with a couple young?
Yeah, you just see you didn't get a good look at the animals, but you could see the hindquarters, and you could see the long stiff tail with the stripes.
I say it was kind of canine looking, but it's very unique. It would be hard not to recognize it as being, it's not a feral dog, it's not a dingo. You would be able to tell the difference.
Jason, another question about the Yowie. Speaking on food, what would you say might be the most likely natural resources for their diet? If the Yowie are out there and they're hunting and they're trying to eat, what other things around would you say might be part of something that they could use to eat, whether it's plant-based or other animals?
I think it would be both. I think they're omnivores. They would eat all the fruit, plants out there, but I believe they would also eat meat, which that's another thing people report that live out in the wilderness of losing their pets. I think they would eat dogs, cats, but then there's all kinds of wild natural wallabies is a big thing. Rabbits were introduced there, but there is a bad rabbit problem out there. And there are just all kinds of smaller mammal types. And I do think they would eat anything like that. I don't think they do the larger kills like we have Bigfoot as reporting killing deer and all. I believe the Yowies do more of the smaller prey.
What do you think holds their population in check?
Just as with most wildlife, human encroachment on their environment.
Something I was always curious about. Go ahead.
No. Oh, look, he's saying I am dragging it out, so stretch it out.
Well, when you were down there, did you notice, because you were down in the eastern part of Australia where it's kind of forested and whatnot, here we noticed the Bigfoot stick to the rivers and waterways, but down there I could see a very large reason why they might rethink that decision, as in the 18-foot saltwater crocodiles. I was kind of curious if the Yowie sightings, if they tended to steer away from particularly crocodile-infested waterways.
I hadn't really thought about that, but now that you mention it, yes, most of the reports I got would not have been in areas that have a large...
See, that'd be something that really points
crocodiles.
towards biological, because if people were making up sightings, they would say, oh yeah, they're down there on the river with the crocodiles. But I'm sorry, I don't care how big the Yowie is or the Bigfoot would be. If an 18-foot saltwater croc decides it's going to make a meal out of it.
Yes, with no problem. And of course, being a wild animal, they are around a water source. But yes, I really hadn't thought about that, but no, they weren't anywhere. Well, there weren't many reports where there were large numbers of crocodiles.
I was kind of curious about that.
Jason, you were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier. What would you say the main differences would be? A lot of times people often immediately relate the Yowie to Bigfoot or Sasquatch. If one were to argue that it isn't one of those things, but it still exists. It's something else. What would you say are the biggest arguments would be against it being Bigfoot, but maybe its own thing? Is there anything that you've come across that says that the Yowie does exist, but it's not Bigfoot related with something else?
Nothing that I would consider strong evidence. As I said, that one marsupial that they know existed, it was actually in the islands just north of Australia. It wasn't ever really reported as in Australia, but they think it could be a descendant or something related to that. But nothing I would put a strong belief in. I think it's very similar to Bigfoot. I think it's the same creature as, you know, you have in Asia the Yeti, and that difference between Bigfoot and the Yeti, Bigfoot and the Yowie. I think just regional differences, but all basically the same creatures, maybe different species or subspecies. But yeah, I would not think it's not related to Bigfoot in some way. Bless you.
So, when you've gone searching Bigfooting down in Texas, southeast Texas, did you ever run into Bob Garrett down there?
Yeah,
Okay.
I met him years ago. Just met him. That was actually in Sam Houston National Forest.
Yeah, and I think they've had some trouble with finding camps all torn up and no people there. And there were drag marks out to the lake, something right there. And
Yeah, and I would have to call BS on that one.
well, he's got it on film. It was a video on.
Yeah, and I have a good friend that really looked into that. And when you think about it, like the one person was rushed to the hospital and the sheriff's department came out and investigated. And that's just too many people involved for it not to get out. And other than his little video of it,
Well, they
she
said that-
she could not confirm it with anybody.
I think it was named that does the Bigfoot Odyssey. He's gone down there and says that as the sun's going down, the planes, you can, because it's close to the Houston airport there, I guess.
There's
They're
flights on the
out
way.
there making all sorts of ape noises and stuff, acting crazy. But they think it's, it's really humid, really hot, because it's Houston. And you got the airport, you got all this restriction. That's all they have is that area. Of course, I'm sure it doesn't keep them confined to that area at night.
No, because it's a huge area and it's really close to the big thicket. And I know a lot of researchers. There are so many researchers in Sam Houston National Forest now. I don't even go there anymore. I mean, you're doing a call and be answering the researcher just down the road. Yeah. So I honestly I don't buy into that report. I don't believe these creatures are really aggressive, because all the aggressive actions that you hear about, they chase you, they'll throw things at you. I mean, if they wanted to, they could very easily grab you and rip your head off. And you just don't get those reports. It scared me and I ran and it chased me. If it chased you and wanted to catch you, it certainly could. Yes, ma'am.
Have you had heard of Sasquatch and Bigfoot and UFO sightings at the same time?
Yes, I have, and I don't know what to make of that, honestly. Robert would always say,
They make you feel
I like to keep my mysteries separated. Don't mix them all up together.
No, Most people, I mean, a lot of Bigfoot people will do that. They say, "Oh, I'm not into UFOs, I'm just into Bigfoot only." But with all the people saying that they've seen lights just before a Bigfoot sighting, or vice versa, it has to raise the question about how they could potentially be related.
See, and I raised that question, and
Paranormal
I
is
will
paranormal.
talk to people about that. Whereas a lot of my Bigfoot researcher friends, they don't even want to talk to you about it.
Did you hear anything about that Australia as far as UFOs and
No.
Yowies together?
I heard absolutely nothing
Okay.
about that.
You might have mentioned this. Is there an official stance that the Australian government has on the Yowie? Have they ever, in either recent or past decades, said anything, made any kind of like announcement or release or any kind of
Not an
like
official
even
government.
like for public relations, marketing, anything like that? They've never that you
Well,
know.
marketing, it's as big over there as Bigfoot is here.
Yeah.
There's Yowie, everything's Yowie candy, Yowie toys. But officially, a statement from the government, no. They don't say it exists. They don't say it doesn't exist.
There's actually a brand of the little miniature figures like they sell in museums of animals into zoos. There's actually a brand that sells those called Yowie out of Australia.
It is big business, but officially the government won't say anything one way or the other.
It's like here.
Yep.
I'd like to add one thing about one of the most famous Yowie sightings that I'm aware of involved a member of Australian Parliament, a guy named Dennis Shea. And in the 1980s, he came out and said that when he was a kid at a boys' camp in Australia, he and a bunch of other boys at the boys' camp saw this Yowie on a hill and watched it. And a whole bunch of people saw it. And he was quiet about it for years and years, but when he was finally elected to the Australian Parliament, he came out in public and said, "I've seen a Yowie, they exist," which you gotta imagine as a member of Parliament to come out and say that to the public. Yes, and he was very convincing that, hey, why would I risk my whole career in life to tell you this unless it really happens?
And when he was describing it, though, it wasn't like a Bigfoot creature.
That I don't know.
That I think was more like a giant wombat, which is what that one kind of looks like. But
Well, some of the weird footprints you see from Australia really do look like big wombat footprints.
yeah,
For those of you that don't know, wombats have very bizarre feet, but there's some of the species of them that are very large down there, and we're talking the size of like a small bear. And I've seen footprint casts from those wombats that almost look like 8 feet.
I haven't seen any
I'll have
casts.
to show it to you.
But you think about a group of teenage or younger boys out in the woods and they see this huge wombat thing, it could be a Yowie, right? And I do believe in these creatures, but I also have, I want to see the proof.
All right. I think we're just about
Okay,
coming to a close here.
any more questions? Comments? Stories? Okay, then, thanks again for coming out.
Okay, guys, once again, we're going to take a 15